Hi, welcome to the Moral Healthcare YouTube channel. Along my path of trying to learn about cognitive psychology and how to apply it to healthcare, one of the influences that I've had is Professor Dan Ariely. Professor Ariely teaches at Duke University, and he's a cognitive psychologist. He wrote the famous book, Predictably Irrational, which is a really nice overview of cognitive psychology and how we think irrationally, as the title implies. As I was doing research on Dan, I found this YouTube video called How Equal Do We Want the World to Be? And I think it's really instructive for exactly the reason he intends it to be instructive, in that he talks about how we perceive wealth in the world, how we would like wealth in the world to be, and what can we do to make that better. For my purposes, as I watched it through the lens of someone who was trying to take those same ideas and apply them to healthcare. So I urge you to go look at that video. I'll put the link down below. But in the meantime, I'm going to run through a few of his slides and try to make a point about how we might use this for healthcare. So he starts out with the question of, what do we think the level of inequality in America is for wealth and for CEO salaries? So here's what we think we know. We think we know that the top 20% of earners in the United States have about 60% of the wealth. The next 20% have about 20% of the wealth. The next 20%, so that'll be the middle quintile, have about 12%, and then the bottom 40% have what's remaining, as you see in the orange and red bars, so not so much. So that's how we think wealth is distributed in the United States. Well, turns out we're fairly far off. And how far off are we? As you can see here, 20%, the top 20% actually have 84% of the wealth. The next 20% have 11% of the wealth, and the rest of us, the bottom 60%, share the rest of it. And as you can see, the way those bars are pushed, the bottom 40% get almost nothing. So that's the actuality. Well, after he surveyed them on that, he asked them, well, what do you think we should have? How should it be? Well, that's where he comes to the final graph on what we think the wealth distribution should be. And what we think it should be is that the wealthiest should have about 30% of the wealth. The next 20% should have about 22% of the wealth. The middle quintile should have about 20% of the wealth. And then the remainder should be distributed between the bottom two quintiles, and pretty evenly, 14% for the second to the bottom and 10% for the very bottom. So that is extremely generous way to think about wealth distribution. And so what he asserts is that we have a knowledge gap, and that's, as you can see in the slide, what we think we know and what reality is. And then he goes on to talk. Professor Ariely talks about the knowledge gap, and that is the difference between what we think we know and what reality is. And he also talks about the action gap, which is between what is and what we want, and how do we get there. And I'll come back to that in a minute. In the meantime, he also asked about the pay ratio of CEOs to unskilled workers. And as you can see on this graph, he has in the red what's actually happening. In yellow, he has what we think is happening. And then in blue, he has the ideal. So as you can see, they're off, but not really as drastically, perhaps, as we thought in the wealth distribution slides I mentioned a minute ago. He then goes on to talk about the pay ratio of CEOs to workers. And as you can see here, in red, he put the actual ratios. In yellow, he put what we estimated the ratios to be. And in blue, he put what we think the ideal ratios are. And looking at this, really not so bad. It's not a whole lot different than the gaps that we saw when he was asking about wealth distribution. But, oh, surprise, he had the scales wrong. And so once he rescaled them to how they actually are, you can see that in the red, the actual ratio of CEO pay to worker pay is absolutely phenomenally high. And what we think it is way, way off. And our ideal assessment is way, 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 way off. So he again points out that we have a knowledge gap, what we think and what is actuality. And then we have the desirability gap, which is what we think and what we think it should be. And then finally, we have the action gap, is how do we make reality what we think we want. He then talks about John Rawls. And John Rawls is a famous philosopher who in the early 70s wrote a book called A Theory of Justice. And his basic idea is what you see here. A just society is a society that if you knew everything about it, you'd be willing to enter it in a random place. In other words, as a disinterested person designing the society. And what he talks about is a veil of ignorance. If you were behind a veil of ignorance and you had to construct society, how would you do it? And how would you do it so that no matter where you ended up, you would be satisfied with that? So you design a society where if you end up as a custodian or as a CEO or as a doctor or as a teacher or whatever, you would think that would be a reasonably fair society. Again, he's talking about society as a whole, but society as a whole is really not my lane, but healthcare is my lane. And I think if we sat down for a few minutes and looked at the various sectors in healthcare, such as the health insurance industry or pharma or medicine in general, hospitals, hospital administrators, CEOs, nurses, nurses' aides, radiology technicians, you name it. If we sat down and thought about how wealth and income should be distributed among those groups, I think we'd find that, one, we're way off in what we think the situation is. Two, we'd be way off in what we think the situation should be. And three, we'd have to consider figuring out how to make it better. One of the reasons it's not better is because the people who are making lots of money in health plans or pharma, or people who have businesses in coding or laboratory or whatever, they don't want to let go of that money. And I've said many times that one man's waste is another man's revenue. And I don't think that's so true anywhere as it is in healthcare. I've often referred to Elizabeth Rosenthal's book, An American Sickness. And in the first chapters, she goes through sector by sector of the healthcare industry and talks about some of the problems in there. But to me, probably one of the biggest problems is that so many of those sectors do nothing of value. And at some point, we have to have a discussion about what's valuable in healthcare. And if it's not valuable, why are we still doing it? If it's just a jobs program and we want to admit that it's a jobs program, okay, that's something we can discuss. But if we're just doing it just to do it and bad things are happening because of it, I think we ought to rethink our strategy. Thanks for listening. I hope to have another video out in a week or two, and have a good day.